How does a franchise brand that is emerging stay ahead of the competition and kind of break through the market?
So I think it depends on on the life cycle. So when brands are really young and just starting out new, like I have to put emerging brands into different buckets. So there's emerging brands who, let's say they have one or two locations and they're really bootstrapping their franchising efforts because there's not enough what we call like recurring revenue to support. So for those brands, they have to go slow and be very thoughtful about their first partners. And it should really be like in their network. The reason why I say that is because their cost of failure could bring down their whole business, right? Because one or two locations, they might have financed getting franchising started. So they're already kind of in debt and behind the eight ball in terms of having capital to like support a growth story. So like proving out that there's like someone owning the business can be replicated versus like a business that has 10 to 20 corporate locations. So that type of emerging brand has the recurring revenue that comes from corporate locations to be able to maybe acquire, go a little bit faster, to be able to spend on things like hiring a full-time franchise salesperson and maybe hiring outsource resources like PR to like help generate for lead development. So to me, these are kind of different profiles of emerging brands.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to, I've kind of got lost. You like what your question? I was so focused on making sure I differentiated who's who.
Yeah. I'm trying to figure out like, okay, an emerging brand, but you're right. There are emerging brands. They're trying to break out of this crowded market.
Yes.
That exists, right? How do they get ahead of the competition? But it sounds like what you're saying is, of course, they're coming in a couple of flavors, right? I have the one franchise system that they're growing onesie, twosie, they are slow and steady. And then we have the folks that do have a considerable number of corporate owned locations. They have the cash flow. They can put the pedal to the metal a little bit. I assume what you're trying to say is they're spending more money on marketing. They have the access to capital to be able to try to grow. So
Yes.
are you saying really you need to stay in your lane, basically?
Yeah. Well, so getting back to your question, how do you differentiate? And so I think of these things as, okay, so from a franchise development standpoint, how do you differentiate? For a smaller brand, you have to differentiate what your strength is. Is that you are the founder, you are the person who's going to be working with them, and you're going to do slow growth because you are personally invested in someone's success. And so you're not going to be someone who's going to quickly get run over because of fast growth or, unrealistic expectations of maybe other brands. So I would lever, like kind of localize the franchise development effort, be one-on-one with the person who's going to grow.
Mm-hmm.
And so to me, then you're building like the very solid foundation versus a brand that has 10, 20 units, they have a solid foundation. So from that standpoint, they can lever off the fact that like we've proven this out across multiple geographies.
Mm-hmm.
So to your point, they can grow faster and then they have financials to demonstrate. I looked at an emerging brand in one of our new concept reports, just randomly, first one, and it's in the medical field, and they're generating $4+ million per location for all of their like 11 corporate stores. I mean, that's a very different value proposition.
Mm-hmm.
So that particular type of profile of franchisor can they can make a difference by saying, look at our experience, look at the bench strength of our executive team,
Right.
look what infrastructure we have. So these two should be going to market differently.
Mm-hmm. True. I want to go back to expectations, though, of these emerging franchises. So I've probably interviewed between 70 and 80 people since the end of
Wow.
July, right? We released our first
Amazing.
episode September 2023, but we started recording at the end of July. It definitely ranges from folks that are saying, hey, slow and steady. I'm okay with having 2, 3. I want to have 10 next year. I've had other people who are saying, I have 3 open. I have 200 in development, And by the time that podcast airs, they're talking about maybe having 300 open. So it runs the gamut. I hear only the anecdotal stories. I don't have the data to support this, but it does sound like franchisors, we're in this new golden age of selling franchises, maybe because of the FSOs and the brokers. But I don't mean to sound so old from way back in 2003, but way back in 2003, it didn't happen like that. And I feel like there are so many brands that they are selling an enormous amount of locations. And is it just me with anecdotal stories, or are we in this new golden age of selling a massive amount of locations that are in development but not open? What do you think? Does the data support that?
So there is a gap in terms of data that is not reportable. Meaning the data that we gather is the number of units that are opened and those that are projected to open and the number of agreements that are signed. Sales is a totally different thing. So I can sell 10 locations, right? So I remember there's an emerging brand in my market that's in the dry cleaning business, and they sold a 100-unit development agreement in the West Coast. That never has to be reported anywhere unless it's on a press release. So the actual number of sold is a mystery in our industry.
Okay.
Okay. So the question of how many sold actually get opened is actually a question that people have asked us, but there's no real data to support what that answer is. When, say, a bank or a franchisee comes to me and they say, "Oh, I'm looking at this franchise and they've got 200 locations," and I look up on their website and I'm like, "There's two," or I look in our database and there's two. I say, okay, let's think about this. They have the promise of 230. And if you have two, would that scare you?
Yeah.
I mean, it scares me
Yeah.
because it tells me that they have emphasized selling and not opening. So as a prospective franchise owner, I would pause. I would pause and say, okay, where am I in that 230? Like, how important am I going to be if I'm
Sure.
number 231?
Right.
Probably not particularly important because they're gonna have to focus on getting these 230 open, right? So they've got obligations that are outstanding. The other thing is, from an emerging brand perspective, I hear emerging brands, they seem very cavalier in the way they say, like, oh, if someone doesn't open, it's like, oh, it's non-refundable. That money's gone, right? Like if they sold it to a broker, for instance, they have to pay the broker. And so that money is gone. They can't refund it. So one of the issues when Quiznos grew very quickly is their fees were non-refundable. And guess what happened? Enough people got together and said, "Hey, this isn't right. I just paid you whatever at the time. At the time, it was 25,000. These days, initial franchise fees are higher. So
Right.
let's say they're 50,000. I paid you $50,000 for the pleasure of nothing."
Exactly. It's funny you mentioned Quiznos because as you were talking earlier, my mind immediately went to Quiznos, and I remember all of the bad press. I mean, it was rightfully so, but I thought of Quiznos right away. That's a great example of a concept that sold a ton of franchises, and how many of them did not open?
And it's not for, I remember this back in the day, people were looking for locations. They just couldn't find locations.
Right.
And if they found a location, it wasn't necessarily getting approved. So you have these things that are outside of a franchisee's control to getting open. And then the franchisor says, "No, I'm not going to refund you." Doesn't seem right. So here's what I would say is the emphasis on selling needs to be tempered a bit with the emphasis on viability to open, right? So like, let's not get people into training and signing franchise agreements if we know they're not going to be able to get financing, right? Like you're just causing not only yourself headache, potential lawsuits, legal fees, but you're also creating potential issues with franchising,
Right,
you know,
right.
like legislation, like this stuff boils up eventually. It might take some time, but it does. So kind of slow down the process to making sure you're getting people to, are they going to get financing? If they don't get financing, then they should be able to get their franchise fee back, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because these are things that these should be predicated on checking certain boxes. Now, someone failing training, like, okay, that's their problem. Like,
Right.
so, but things that are not within the franchisee's control should not put a franchisee out of certain funds that they would have maybe promised or delivered.
Thank you for tuning into the Emerging Franchise Brands podcast. For additional insights, guest applications, and to stay connected, visit us at efbpodcast.com. The Emerging Franchise Brands podcast is for entertainment purposes only, and the views expressed do not necessarily represent those of Emerging Franchise Brands, its host Frank Fiume, or Emerging Franchise Group LLC. Any discussed franchise or investment opportunity requires thorough investigation, obtaining proper disclosure documents, and expert consultation before making any investment decisions. The podcast and its host do not offer professional advice or endorsements, and they hold no responsibility for actions, representations, accuracy, or consequential damages related to the podcast content.